Welcome to Disability Through a Native American Lens. We're glad you're here. My name is Yusra Benjeloun, Administrative Coordinator and Project Manager with the Work Wellness and Disability Prevention Institute, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. This webinar is made possible through the support of the Community Gaming Grant Program through the BC Government, as well as donations and memberships to WWDPI. We thank our program partners, Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work, Education Advisory Committee, and speakers who contribute to this webinar series. While we're waiting for others to join us, I'll go over a few technical points for the webinar. You should be able to hear the presentation through your computer speakers or through the conference call line if you dialed in. Please use the question box to submit any issues you may be experiencing and to ask any questions you have related to the presentation. We will collect questions submitted throughout the presentation and follow it with a Q&A based on the questions submitted. Following the webinar, any questions not answered in the allotted time will be answered and distributed after the event. The presentation will be recorded and posted for free on our website within a week along with the slides. You will be emailed the direct links for all of these items when they're available. As I mentioned, my name is Yusra and I'll be moderating the webinar. Our discussant today will be Matthew Galina. Matthew will start our Q&A session, and I will continue by asking the questions raised by our audience. Matthew Galina is a National Training Coordinator for the Indigenous Skills and Employment Strategy programs at the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples. Our presenter today is Dr. Hilary Weaver. Dr. Hilary Weaver is a professor and associate dean for academic affairs in the School of Social Work, University at Buffalo State University of New York. She received her Bachelor of Science from Antioch College in Social Work with a cross-cultural studies focus and her Master's in Social Work and Doctorate in Social Work from Columbia University. Her teaching, research, and service focus on cultural issues in the helping process with an emphasis on Indigenous populations. Dr. Weaver received funding from the National Cancer Institute to develop and test a culturally grounded wellness curriculum for urban Native American youth, the Healthy Living in 2 Words program. She's a member of NASW, CSWE, and currently serves as president of the Indigenous and Tribal Social Work Educators Association, formerly American Indian Alaska Native Social Work Educators Association. Dr. Weaver has presented her work regionally, nationally, and internationally, including presenting at the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues at the United Nations between 2005 and 2008 and 2013 and 2018. She has numerous publications including the text Explorations in Cultural Competence, Journeys to the 4 Directions in 2005 and the edited book Social Issues in Contemporary Native America, Reflections from Turtle Island in 2014. And now I will hand it over to you, Hilary.
Thank you very much. A little bit more about myself and how I come to this topic. I am a social worker. I am Lakota. I'm not an expert in disability, but I'm focused all my work around making sure that social workers and other helping professionals serve diverse populations appropriately. That we're always including that cultural piece, whether we're working with elders or kids or whether it's health issues or whatever it is, because social workers always talk about starting where the client is. And for a lot of us, a central part of our identity is our culture. So I really want to make sure that that cultural piece is included. I was approached a number of years ago to see if I would do a special issue of a journal focused on Native Americans and disability. And I had recognized that there's very little written about that. I mean, there's a few articles here and there, but not a whole lot. So I did what I could to recruit co-authors, and I did eventually publish the journal. It's also released as a book. And my remarks today are related to the introduction to that issue, to that journal. I do want to be clear that a lot of this is a culturally based understanding of things that are out there in the literature. A lot of it provides that Indigenous context for ways to look at things. And as I was preparing my remarks today, I do realize that I circle back to some of these topics. It's not as linear as perhaps some other traditional PowerPoints. I'm certainly not coming at this from a medical model, but rather as an Indigenous person who really cares about these issues and wants to make sure that other human service professionals are attentive to the cultural piece. So that's a bit about how I'm approaching this. The images on the screen reflect who I am. You see kind of a traditional medicine wheel there that reflects my Lakota background. And I have spent the majority of my adult life in Haudenosaunee territory. So I'm very much a part of that community as well. That's why you see the Hiawatha belt represented. So probably no great surprise to my audience members out there, disability is a socially constructed identity. It's not one monolithic thing, it's how we see it. So what constitutes a disability and what it means to be a person with a disability, well, that varies a lot depending on the lens that you're looking through. It varies a lot depending on your cultural context. So to give you a bit of an overview of the things that I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to start with a little bit about Native Americans, because I think that a lot of people don't know a lot about Native Americans. So I'm going to provide a very basic overview, a little bit about disability within Native American cultural contexts, get into a little bit of prevalence and disproportionate impact, although I do that cautiously because I don't have a whole lot of faith in the statistics that are out there. And throughout the presentation, you'll hear an emphasis on how the societal context really frames both attitudes and services. And our societal context, when we're talking about Native Americans, is a context of ongoing colonization. So I'm going to wrap up with a little bit on the promise of decolonization, of how we move past these impediments. Right. So to get you started on, this overview of Native Americans, we are a young and growing population. According to the U.S. Census, there are 5.2 million Native Americans. Right. That number is not necessarily an accurate reflection, certainly in the region where I am, Haudenosaunee territory, which crosses both to the Canadian side and the U.S. side. There are many, many people here who will not answer the census because they have a strong sense of Indigenous identity and so don't like the idea of being counted by someone else. So we can assume that that's an underestimate. I've provided some pictures from the U.S. Census to give you a bit of a sense of the population and how it's distributed down here in the United States. I'm not under the illusion that you can clearly read these slides, but I think they do give you just a visual idea of where populations are located within the United States. You see the darker areas on the U.S. map that reflect a larger population. On the bar chart from the census, you will see that there's a great variance in the size of different tribes, with the Cherokee being the largest, the Navajo being the second largest. And you also see listings for groups like Mexican indigenous people who happen to be in this country. That's a large number as well. There are over 500 federally recognized tribes in the United States, and that number is growing. There is a list of tribes seeking federal recognition. Tremendous diversity. We do not share one language, one culture, one social structure. And as I mentioned, we cross borders. So there are groups like the Mohawk that are on both the US and the Canadian side. There are groups that straddle the US-Mexican border. So we're not necessarily defined by these boundaries, but there is tremendous diversity. In terms of health, when you look at the health of Indigenous populations around the world, we are typically disproportionately represented in terms of all of the bad stuff, all of the bad health issues, as well as educational and social issues, poverty, things like that. One thing that I do want to make sure that helping professionals understand is sovereignty. That is a key issue when we're speaking of Indigenous people, whether it's in the US, Canada, or other countries around the world. Indigenous populations pre-existed the nation states that now surround them. And we are left with remnants of that independence in spite of colonization. So as I begin to talk more about the social policies in the United States and how those affect health issues and disability issues, we need to understand that there is still a nation-to-nation relationship between Indigenous peoples and the settler states that have come to surround them, and that is sovereignty. So the federal trust responsibility is the agreement that we still have today between Indigenous nations, and today I'm speaking primarily of the US context, but it applies in Canada and other places as well, and the nations that surround us. So treaties are still legally binding documents. In these documents, the federal government assumed responsibility, and they gained things through these documents as well. I've heard some people refer to treaties as prepaid health plans or prepaid educational agreements. So in exchange for giving up things like territory, the government agreed to provide healthcare, education, services. It is also noteworthy, though, that in addition to providing various services, federal governments assumed responsibilities much as Guardian does for wards. And there's something insidious about that. There is a legally enshrined paternalism. And as I started to delve into the literature on Indigenous peoples and disability, I see parallels between how Native people have been treated and how people with disabilities have been treated. This sense of paternalism, not recognizing capabilities, creating and perpetuating dependency. I think there's some very startling parallels there that that are noteworthy, that we need to be aware of. So in terms of policies and Native Americans, sovereignty has continued to be diminished through a series of court cases. And I would argue, and you find this in the literature, that indeed in the United States, our policies have had what I would call a crippling effect on Native Americans. Colonization has indeed created dependency, and I don't think that that's exclusive to the United States. I believe that we would find something very similar in other places as well. So I do want to comment on some particular risk factors for disabilities that we see among Indigenous populations. The Keltner article that I cite here, and I would strongly recommend taking a look at the reference list that I provide for you, because there's some interesting pieces there. But Keltner and colleagues did some research looking at the isolation that you see in some members of southeastern tribes in the United States. When colonization happened here, as it did elsewhere, sometimes indigenous people really did their best to get out of the way, to avoid the onslaught. And so in hiding, they became fairly isolated, and Keltner points to some genetic inbreeding and high rates of rare recessive genetic disorders. So isolation can be one factor that feeds into the creation of disability. A big factor that I would point out is the overcrowding, the close confinement, the unsanitary conditions.
Yeah, why don't we wait till tomorrow in the webinar? Thanks.
When Native Americans have been confined in on reservations, in boarding schools or residential schools, conditions where infectious diseases were easily spread, where medical care was inferior or unavailable, and the segregation and discrimination inherent in these systems fostered a lot of health disparities. So the conditions that Indigenous people were subjected to were ripe for creation of various health issues. Some of the factors that also present risk for disability are poverty. And of course, that's not unique to Indigenous populations. We see that there are strong links between poverty and various health issues, including disability. But you do see that around the world, Indigenous populations are disproportionately affected by poverty. You see that Indigenous populations also have disproportionate rates of military service, and Native Americans were often serving in frontline combat. That's a risk for disability. They were out there exposed to tremendous risks. And again, in the literature, you see this thread of the impact of colonization, the impact of racism, what that does to people psychologically as well as physically, and the synergy between those areas. And, you know, at this point, I think you're pretty clear that I'm not talking about colonization as a historical factor only. It is still present in our day-to-day lives. It is still a risk factor for disabling conditions. So colonization is really all-encompassing. It affects mental health, it affects health. Some people, like the Freeman article that I cite here, specifically look at mental health and incongruities between Indigenous worldviews and the societies that came to surround them as leading to such disharmony that it could cause emotional distress. I would say that colonial actions are both disabling and deculturizing. Cultures were deliberately destroyed. Not only is there a physical aspect, but the stress, the de-stress that happens with this. The second picture that I have for you here with this slide, I don't know if you can really tell what that is, but if you take a close look, those are buffalo skulls that have been piled up. And the Indigenous people of the Great Plains area, our lives were intimately intertwined with the buffalo. These are our relatives. This is our source of food, of clothing, of so many implements of daily life. It's connected to who we are as peoples. And so when I think of colonization, I also think of how it can break hearts, how it can break minds, how it can break bodies, and how it can break community. And when you think of it that way, yes, I do see colonization as a major factor in creating disability. Something that I'd like to particularly call your attention to is environmental racism. And obviously this is not an issue only for Indigenous peoples, but it's an issue for many peoples of color. The first study that I show there about Navajo neuropathy is a study that was done on the Navajo reservation. Some of you may know that there was tremendous mining that took place there on the Navajo reservation. They were mining for uranium. Well, they were mining for a lot of things, but in particular, uranium to feed the Cold War between the United States and Russia, to feed American military might. There is clear evidence that the United States government understood the risks of this mining and did not inform people, did not inform the miners, did not inform the population there. This particular article, the Lewis article, you'll see at the end of the site, there are three Nez's, Nez, Nez, and Nez. Those are people who were directly affected by this mining. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Helen Nez's story. She's one of the co-authors there. So Helen Nez, Navajo woman, lived her whole life at the Blue Gap chapter of the Navajo Nation near Tachi, Arizona. Her first child was born when she was 25 years old. She had 11 children. One of her children was stillborn. She lost 6 of her children to Navajo neuropathy. It's a disability that wasn't even recognized when she was first beginning to have children. So 3 of her children, Jerome Nez, he was born in 1967, died in 1970. Claudia Nez, born in 1970, died in 1972. And Euphemia Nez, born in 1975, died in 1978. They all died before their 3rd birthday. Their stomachs became bloated. Their eyes were just this cloudy gray color when they became sick. Another child, Dorenta Nez, had to be sent away to Albuquerque for treatment when she became ill. She died coughing up blood when she was 3 years old in 1978. So 2 of Helen's children did live into early adulthood. Teresa lived to be 25, but she started dialysis treatment when she was 19, and then she died of kidney failure. Cedar lived to be 35. Now, Helen did have 4 surviving children, but they all had disabilities too. They had milder disabilities and recurring health problems. There are so many people in this community who became sick and died because of this environmental racism. Not a whole lot has been published about Navajo neuropathy. I was actually very proud to be able to publish this particular study. Please do take a look at it. It's very painful, but it does show the impact of the environment. And it's not the impact of the natural environment, it's the impact of a racist environment that allows these things in Indigenous communities. Some of you may be familiar with Chemical Valley. Please take a look at the Wybe book. It talks about a reservation surrounded by the largest collection of petrochemical plants anywhere in the world. This is in Ontario. And it talks about what happens to these people. It talks about really frightening things like changes in the gender of the children. They're having very, very few male babies born there these days. I believe that there are ongoing genetic changes happening to the Indigenous people of Chemical Valley. So, yeah, please take a look at these things that I cite in the reference list. There's powerful, powerful things that we should all be aware of. And for all of us, I would also say calls to action. We need to be aware of how the environment creates disabilities. Talk briefly about how the cultural context shapes perceptions. So I even question terms like disability because I think that when we hear that term in the US and in other mainstream societies, it's usually framed as something to be overcome. And I think that's based on cultural ideas about independence. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You have to be able to function in a certain way. Well, that's through that cultural lens that I talked about at the very beginning. Culture shapes perceptions. There are, however, other ways to look at it. And I think disability can be perceived very differently in cultural contexts where interdependence is accepted and indeed valued. It can be defined more as differences, as variations, rather than defining difference as deviance. So within Indigenous cultural contexts, we don't necessarily have the disparaging slang. We don't necessarily have words that mean the same connotations that disability has in English. And I think that indeed imposing one society's ideas about ability or disability on another can create disability where difference exists. When we value interdependence, harmony, balance, and responsibility for others, it gives a different perspective on normalcy. And if people are in balance with the others around them, then that's natural. That is normal. If you're fulfilling a societal role, it doesn't matter that you don't have the same talents, gifts, abilities as other people. We're all different. And when you look at the research on Native American contexts and disability, disability is typically viewed as just, it's one part of who you are, doesn't necessarily define you. The connections between people, like your clan, your tribe, your community, are more likely to be the defining aspect of who somebody is. And things like emotional disturbance, mental health issues, may be viewed as something that requires more of a rebalancing or some sort of a spiritual remedy. So I like this Simmons article with their Circles of Care project. They took a look at how we think about serious emotional disturbance, and they found that the definitions that are usually used are very deficit focused. They don't fit Indigenous perspectives. Challenges can be part of somebody's life path, so they set out to find new ways of defining this difference in people. So yeah, I like that study that they did. A little bit about prevalence, although I say this very cautiously because I don't think that our statistics are very good. A lot of times Indigenous people are left out of studies or were misidentified. Indigenous people might be labeled as Hispanic, as white, because we're just not recognized. But there are studies that suggest that we do have higher rates of disability, a little bit higher in the United States. Some of the disabilities most commonly found would be things like spinal cord injuries, complications from diabetes, blindness, mobility impairments. In terms of mental health issues, there are some people that do see this as the largest unmet health need for Indigenous people. There is data that suggests that for both mental health issues and for health issues, there tends to be earlier onset of disability, greater lifetime prevalence. But again, you got to kind of question the statistics, question the studies. And even when there are studies on the health impact, they don't necessarily get into the functional impact. So the line between health issues and disability is not necessarily very clear there. If we're talking about children, accidents, infections, congenital abnormalities are the major causes of disability. Native children are disproportionately represented in special ed services. For instance, in the United States, 17% of youth in Bureau of Indian Affairs or tribal schools are in special ed programs. And the Freeman article documents that 1 in 11 Native youth suffer from serious emotional disturbance. But then we got to, again, question how you're defining that. In terms of elders and disabilities, 28% of those over 45 report functional limitations. So that could be a measure of disability. And 57.6% of those 65 and older reported disability, which is considerably higher than the general population. When you think about that, I think it is important to recognize that Native Americans and indeed indigenous populations around the world often have cumulative lifetime disadvantage. So poverty throughout the lifetime, less access to health care, and fewer educational opportunities. So it does make sense that by the time somebody is older, that it snowballs. So that to me is a likely explanation for why we're seeing greater disabilities for elders. It's a cumulative lifetime disadvantage. So circling back to what I was presenting earlier, we need to understand the societal context. And for Indigenous people, that is intertwined with treaty obligations, federal trust responsibility, the context of colonization. So this slide shows the Navajo tribal chair talking about issues within his tribe, talking about basic things like access to water, access to clean water as a major issue. Circling back to those issues of environmental racism, when communities do not have access to clean water, when they do not have access to clean air, that will have implications for health, for wellness, for disability. All of these things are related. You cannot understand disability without understanding the societal context for people and for communities. So this study, the Young study, I found to be really interesting. And I hope that there will be some follow-up studies. they took a look at activism, at people who stood up for themselves. And if tribes were actively participating in land and water claims, that was associated with lower rates of mobility disabilities. So I find that fascinating. And it also suggests that we have some shaping influence in our destinies. If we get more involved, if we're fighting for our rights, and certainly we need to do that, then that can reduce some of these health deficits. If there is cultural renewal, that can help us be healthier people. Now, this is the only study that I've found along these lines, so maybe some of you out there in the audience will take up this charge, go do this research, because I think that's would be a really interesting area to investigate further. So services, and there's not a whole lot published on services in individual communities. So I put up a brochure from my local community. OAHIO is the local agency here in Western New York that serves people with disabilities, Indigenous people with disabilities. A few years ago, the agency was called NAILS, Native American Independent Living Services, and I like how they kind of decolonized and reclaimed a specifically Indigenous name in the Seneca language for who they are, for who they serve, for the services that they provide. Because I think that there's some really cool, powerful grassroots services that we don't necessarily know about that are addressing issues of disability in Indigenous communities. Now, some of the literature does talk about where people go for help. The Begay study, talking about Navajo families of children with disabilities, primarily using spiritual supports. And that can be very important, especially if you see that as a major role in some of the disabilities. So seeking spiritual supports. It may also speak to mistrust of professionals. We really don't know that. It's another area that deserves more investigation. There is conflicting literature about whether Native Americans do not receive the benefits and services for which they qualify, or perhaps maybe we're accessing services more than non-Indigenous folks. So the Fuller-Thomason article suggests that, we're not accessing services as much as we should, which would fit with a lot of other literature out there. But the Goins article says that at least elders are accessing assistive technology more than non-Native peers. And I would agree with them that that may be because there's less stigma associated with it. So National Congress of American Indians is a multi-tribal group. It's been around for a very long time in the United States, and it issues various policy statements and recommendations. I should apologize for having so many words on this slide. I try not to do that, but if you want to refer back to it later, you've got it. Basically, they're saying that, there's a lot of federal entities that deal with Native Americans. And there are also government entities that deal with disability issues. Wouldn't it be nice if these organizations overlapped or talked to each other? Because they really don't. Not very much anyway. So the organizations that have primary responsibility for the well-being of Native Americans often don't talk to the disability organizations, and the disability organizations don't necessarily know about the Native American organizations. So they're advocating for creation of American Indian Disability Liaison Office to better coordinate. Makes a lot of sense to me, but certainly when you see federal entities, there's typically a lot of lack of coordination, so this is not a big surprise. Disproportionate impact of disabilities, if we believe the statistics that suggest that Native Americans are disproportionately affected by disabilities, and I would lean toward that. I think the statistics are true. I think we're probably affected even more than the statistics reveal. Reasons for disproportionate impact, the literature emphasizes three things: poverty, bias, colonization. So the intersection of poverty and disability, 44% of Native Americans age 45 and above living below the poverty line have disabilities, while only 25% of those above the poverty line do. Not a big surprise. Living in poverty is associated with many health risks, including things like malnutrition, substandard housing. So the social determinants of health play a big role here. Risks related to environmental toxins that I've mentioned, high stress neighborhoods, high crime rates. I don't think it even makes sense to think about which comes first. Are poor people more likely to be disabled? Are disabled people more likely to experience poverty? These things are synergistic. They feed into each other. We must have holistic responses. Bias, I think, plays a big role too. I gave you some statistics a few minutes ago about overrepresentation of Native youth in special ed services. We're not sure how much of that is actual need. Does it reflect testing bias? We know that standardized tests are not necessarily normed for linguistically and culturally diverse populations. We know that attitudes can influence labeling and diagnoses. And again, I'm seeing parallels when I reflect on the literature. The bias against both people with disabilities and Indigenous people being defined as not fully competent, that theme continues to contemporary times. It was certainly there historically. It is there today. I think there is bias against both populations, and it certainly has a synergy at the intersection of these populations. I think that we often turn difference into deviance. Like I'm wondering, why do we even think of black sheep as bad? That's what I thought of when I put up that picture for you. This whole idea of difference as deviance, you see that a lot in the eugenics movement. The eugenics movement that targeted people for being so-called defectives, specifically targeted a lot of Native Americans. There's that study that I cite there on Abenaki people. The eugenics movement was very much racialized when they're looking at things like feeble-mindedness, and that was used as an excuse for sterilization. Well, by the 1970s, high percentages of Native American women were sterilized under the auspices of the Indian Health Services, the agency that was supposed to serve them. There's your federal trust responsibility again. And these women were often sterilized without consent. We're seeing some very disturbing parallels between how people with disabilities were perceived and treated and how Indigenous people have been perceived and treated, both in trying to shut people away and in trying to sterilize them. So I've pointed out a lot of things related to colonization, a lot of things related to attitude, to perceptions as problems. I'm going to talk briefly about decolonization, and then I'm going to wrap up because we do need some time for questions. If colonization is the problem, then decolonization can be part of the solution. Decolonization begins with recognizing that these colonial structures are still there and that we are, for the most part, not even questioning them. And I will include Indigenous people in that. We don't necessarily reflect on the day-to-day impact of these colonial structures and how they still constrict us and define us. But if we can raise our consciousness, if we can think about different abilities, not so much as disability, as inferior, as lesser than, as colonization teaches us to think in those terms, then we can reduce the stigma, we can reduce the risk of socially constructed issues, we can be more empowered. Decolonization is needed in all aspects. This image I took here is from the American Alliance of Museums and how they're sketching out their process of decolonization with coming to know, with voice, with hope, with moving toward action. And we must move beyond awareness to action. We must work together to challenge unjust societal structures, because these are the things that shape our lives, they shape our thinking, they shape attitudes about disability, including for Native Americans. Traditionally, we had Indigenous values of harmony and inclusion that didn't separate people, that didn't put people away from us because of differences. Well, I'm not sure that we haven't internalized some of the worst things of colonization, because now we do have some of those negative attitudes. We do have stigma and marginalization in our own communities that traditionally would not have been there. So, you know what? We need an attitude adjustment, is the way that I look at it. So as I wrap up, as I reflect on disabilities and Native people, I think about that colonial context. I think about the socially constructed identities. And if things are socially constructed, if it begins with how we're thinking about things, then we can think about things in a different way. There can be empowerment. There can be reclaiming identities on our own terms as a form of decolonization. We don't have to keep thinking about things the same way. We don't have to be marginalized from the mainstream. We don't have to be conceptualized as deviant. We can reclaim our strengths and our power. We don't have to fit in. Being distinctive can be okay. Difference can be embraced. And we've always had those themes within our communities. There have always been some of us who want to, retain what's special about us and not necessarily assimilate and fit into somebody else's ideas. We can affirm that our differences don't make us lesser than anybody else. So as I wrap up these final images, I love this image of the skate park, and my son is a skater, so he likes anything on wheels. So this image of this person in this chair at a skate park, I love this. I just find this really awe-inspiring. And an image of a contemporary Haudenosaunee person. We can be traditional in a contemporary world. As a Lakota person, one of our most common phrases is Mitakuye Oyashin. We are all related. And that's the title that I used when I did have my special journal issue on Native Americans and disabilities, because we're all related. We're all connected. We don't have to be separate. And so that's how I would like to wrap up today. The PowerPoint includes a reference list, which I encourage you to refer to, because these are the people who have done the original research in these areas, not just my interpretations of them. And I hope that you found this useful. I'm going to turn it over to questions.
Thank you so much, Hilary, for this beautiful presentation and for bringing us closer to the Native American culture. Matthew, would you like to take over with your questions first?
I was just saying thank you very much, and thank you, Hilary, for your presentation. It was very informative, was very insightful, and such an important topic. I want to start off the question session by asking you what really inspired you in your research for this topic.
I believe that whatever sort of field we are in is helping professionals understand the cultural element, to understanding disabilities and health issues as well. I recognize that there was very little in the literature on Native people and disability, and a special journal issue. I see an opportunity. I was very happy to do that because I think we need to get the word out there. I think there's a lot of exciting work being done on the grassroots level. That's my role. That's what I want to do.
Excellent response, and I agree with your assertion that it's difficult to get raw data from the grassroots community. And yeah, exactly. If you could be a bridge between academia and culture, it will have better awareness for everyone involved. You had some great quotes in your presentation. Colonization as a major factor in creating disability. I like that quote. I also liked how you discussed at length some risk factors for disabilities in your presentation today. So I want to ask you, what do you feel is the biggest barrier regarding Native Americans with disabilities?
The biggest barrier to services, you mean?
To services, yeah. I'll let you elaborate however you see fit.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of barriers to services. I think service providers don't necessarily understand populations. So we create barriers. We make it difficult for people to access services. Sometimes we have our agencies in areas that are not accessible to Indigenous communities, particularly communities that are on reserve or reservations. And yeah, I guess I would see a lot of barriers as being within helping professionals. I don't think we recognize trauma, and I realize that I didn't talk a whole lot about trauma today, but certainly as we begin to look at mental health issues and resulting disabilities, social workers, service providers, we need to understand the impact of trauma on Indigenous communities. And if we as service providers can have a better understanding, that will greatly reduce barriers to service.
Trauma, especially intergenerational trauma, you know, stemming from the legacy of residential schools. It's a great barrier in accessing services for Native Americans with disabilities. You also touched on another topic too, and I work for a national Indigenous organization, so I'm very connected to the next point I'd like to make. You talked about the lack of coordination between Indigenous organizations and disability service providers. And I'm experiencing that as well. There's a big disconnect between NIOs and the service providers. I wonder if you could share some ways on how they could work together, some best practices, if you will, to alleviate some of the barriers that you mentioned in my previous question.
I think it begins with leadership of these various organizations and help them see this as a priority. If the disability serving organizations can recognize the need for cultural competence, for cultural humility, for understanding Indigenous peoples and other diverse peoples. If they can make that a priority, that opens the door to collaboration. And on the other side, if organizations such as your own organization or National Congress of American Indians can prioritize this as an issue, then we will learn so much more about the disabling conditions that are prevalent in our communities. There's so many issues, and I'm not sure that that we tend to prioritize issues related to disabilities nearly as much as we could. But if the leadership in these various entities prioritizes it, then we can reduce more of the barriers.
And I want to close my question today and open it up to the general audience with another quote from your presentation. Decolonization moves beyond awareness. And I agree with that, because in this era of reconciliation, it's important for non-Indigenous allies working with Indigenous peoples to, ascertain the treaty rights. So my question is, what are some ways that non-Indigenous allies can assist Native Americans with disabilities?
Oh, well, the first thing for non-Indigenous allies to do is to listen to Indigenous leadership and to work in coalition. The Indigenous leadership needs to prioritize what the issues are and tell specific guidance for how non-Indigenous people can step forward. Some of this may be policy advocacy. It may be getting governments to honor treaties. It may be securing funding for agencies, providing services. Whatever the priorities are, they need to come from the Indigenous communities, and the non-Indigenous allies can step up as followers and as supporters, not as leaders, but as key followers and supporters.
Excellent. Yes, I agree. Leadership is the big key. Before I turn it over to the audience, I do want to thank you again. I'm privileged to be working in the unceded territory of the Algonquins, and I'm also honored to have spent 7 years in Northwest Saskatchewan and the Decolonization people. So I say merci cho for the presentation, and chimiigwech.
You're very welcome.
Thank you so much, Matthew and Hilary, for your explanation. So we don't have much time, but I'll go ahead with 2 questions. So the first one is, how would you suggest large insurance companies work with Indigenous people to assist with their disabilities, treatment programs, etc.?
So you said large insurance companies?
Correct.
Okay. This does get into some very thorny but very important issues, because there is often the question of who would cover the disability. Is it the insurance company? Is it something that a government should cover under treaty rights? I'm remembering a case, I believe it was Jordan's Principle, where a child died when there was a lot of arguments about who should cover things, who should be financially responsible for the care of somebody with a disability. Rather than argue, whoever recognizes the case first should take the lead on it and worry about reimbursement later. I think that's an important thing for insurance companies to acknowledge and to hold as a guiding principle. When there is somebody with a disability who needs care, that care should be provided. Insurance companies should cover that. If there is any question of who would ultimately be responsible for payment, that should come later. if insurance companies would use that as their guiding principle and prioritize well-being over finances, that would change the landscape dramatically.
Thank you so much, Hilary. And our last question is, do you have any examples of decolonizations to share?
Well, I'll just expand very briefly on the one that I mentioned, that our local agency that serves Indigenous people with disabilities went through their own process of how do they even name themselves? How do they define themselves? And flowing from that, how do they define their services? They were NAILS, Native American Independent Living Services, so perfectly respectable name. But I think of the empowerment of self-naming, of using a term in the local language, in the Seneca language, to say, we are Native people serving Native people. And in this case, Seneca people serving Seneca people. That opens the door to infusing Seneca values around services. What should the services look like? How should they be shaped? How should they be offered? What should our outreach look like through a traditional Seneca lens rather than through a more mainstream lens? So that's just a start on decolonization.
Thank you so much, Hilary. We're very thankful for your extremely interesting presentation and for the valuable time you took to explain how Native American culture context influence perceptions of disabilities. Thank you for providing important information on risk factors for disability in Native American populations. Matthew, thank you so much for your pertinent questions and for making the time to be here during this very busy period of the year for you. To our audience, we're grateful that you were able to join us and for your attention and appreciation.